Open to change, conceptualizing commitment flexibility under uncertainty about the future. Hi everyone. I'm going to focus today on how commitment has been characterized in shared intention, paying particular attention to associated interpersonal obligations that some authors believe accompany the commitments we make when acting with others. I believe there's something missing, or at least underdetermined in the way commitments have been understood in existing accounts of shared intention. Specifically, conceptualizing commitments as graded relations that have an associated graded motivational influence. I hope to tentatively provide one idea for doing that here. First, I want to give you a backdrop of what I'm assuming for my project, which builds on work from notable authors in the field. I'm taking for granted a working knowledge of theories of shared intention, and I'm going to go through this quite quickly, so you might want to pause the video if something's unclear. I apologize. So first, I want to just talk about the role of shared intention, which as I see it is to support shared intentional activity. This is the functional role. We form the shared intention to X, and doing so allows us to coordinate our collective activities, notably in ways that support or make more or less likely their success. So existing accounts of shared intention focus on the psychology of agents involved and the norms that govern their reasoning and relations to explain how it plays this role. Moreover, I want to focus on the role of commitment and how commitment is seen to ground or support shared intention. So commitments are characteristic of shared intention in ways that support them performing their functional role of supporting shared activity. So in particular, commitments can emerge from or constitute the norms that govern our behavior together. So we can share intentions only because we are committed in some way. So in short, commitments ground shared intention, which in turn supports shared intentional activity. So there's agreement that commitments are characteristic of shared intention, though of course there's disagreement on how to characterize them. I'm going to adopt the relatively non-controversial, I hope, view that commitments generally give rise to interpersonal obligations. So specifically directed obligations to our joint action partners to contribute to our shared activity as we committed to so doing. So I'll draw on the paradigmatic account involving obligations of this sort, so Margaret Gilbert's. So I don't think it really matters for what I'm after here, whether you see these obligations as essential or not. That's not the discussion I want to have. I want to note that I think they generally involve something like this, and that's good enough for me. So what does it mean to be committed? So a commitment is a relation among two agents in an action, such that one agent has an obligation to their partner to perform the action because they intentionally express their willingness to do the action under conditions of common knowledge, and this has been acknowledged. So key to this role is that commitments allow us to form expectations of our own and others' actions in ways that can be relied on to support shared activities. Why is this useful? Well, when a commitment is in place, an agent is now entitled to expect their partner to perform the action their partner committed to and to rely on that expectation. And their partner has an obligation to them to perform that action. So if a couple of us want to start a little jazz band, one of the ways that we are able to do this is because, first, each of us intends that we meet and play together. Second, each of us knows that the others intend to meet. Third, our intentions are common knowledge. And fourth, crucially, our shared intentions involve a commitment on the part of each of us to meeting. A commitment that might lead us to avoid reconsidering alternatives or to avoid attractive alternatives altogether, or both. And many other assumptions that are foundational to accounts of shared intention can in some way fall out of these assumptions, so things like helping behavior. So in short, we can plan to play together and we make investments on the basis of doing so. So we buy instruments so monetary investments, we have opportunity costs, we set aside time when we could be at the pub, and time and effort costs, practicing in your limited spare time, partly because we can rely on others to do the same. So I'm going to base my project today on an abridged Margaret Gilbert style accounts, mostly from her 2009 paper, and I've just got a couple of quotes that I want to use to make my point. So she says that individuals share an intention when and only when they're jointly committed to intend as a body to do such and such in the future. Right, now joint commitments, which I'm not going to talk about in detail here, but are associated with a sui generis type of interpersonal obligation, one that is rooted in the nature of shared intention being clearly a social phenomenon. That's what she thinks. These obligations play the motivational role characteristic of shared intention. That's what helps organize and coordinate our personal intentions and plans in ways that favor the fulfillment of the shared intention, she says. So as foundational to her view, Gilbert proposes what she calls 3 criteria of adequacy that an account of shared intention must meet. I want to focus on the concurrence criterion that she has here, which is, that absent, which she says, absent special understandings, concurrence of all parties is required to change or rescind a shared intention or to release a given party from participation. And she takes it as read that the account that the account should be such that parties just understand that concurrence is required. Just a matter of what shared intention is, right? So that's where it comes from. She's talking about a specific kind of obligations. These are directed obligations, obligations to another party. She says that rights theorists commonly use the language of directed obligation. And these kind of rights she calls claim rights. So in this construal, parties owe each other an action, right, appropriate to the shared intention. Note that we're not using owe loosely. She literally thinks or means that, owing is construed as the right to an action from you. So Gilbert takes it that to be in a position to demand something from someone is for it to already be in some intuitive sense one's own. Crucially, for what I want to talk about here is, only the claim right holder can demand or release the action, right, to which they have the claim right. This is where Gilbert's concurrence criterion comes from. So I don't want to get into too much detail about claim rights, etc., but I just want to emphasize the point of concurrence, how core this is to account. And I don't think it's that controversial in the sense that, one can't just release oneself an obligation when one so desires, and that's kind of what we want to get to. But there are two linked and important criticisms to Gilbert's account that I want to focus on. The first is that it looks like Gilbert's own relation might be too strong. So Alonso says, understood as a kind of obligation, Gilbert's insight about a distinctive normative relation holding between participants and shared agency risks rejection. Many find obligation, and especially the no unilateral withdrawal condition, to be too strong. Right? That's the first theoretical issue. Second theoretical issue, though, is how strong is too strong? Because it seems like we're still relying on intuition. So, Alonso supports his argument and those of several others, but in general, it's that people feel that her account is too strong. And I think there's an issue here because there's a broader issue, which is that it's not quite clear on her account or several other accounts of shared intention why we are actually motivated to meet our commitments or the obligations they give rise to. So Fernandez, Castro, and Pachauri have pointed this out in a recent paper. They call this a theoretical credibility problem for commitments, in which attempting to map the normative reasons to act that these accounts propose with the motivation to act is unsuccessful. They cannot provide a motivational basis to fully explain why agents abide by their commitments. Right? Even when we add in things like social motions or reputation concerns, we're left wanting. So attempting to explain or conceptualize kind of commitment strength or motivation is not simple. The Sense of Commitment project has provided some empirical insight that might help us. So this project explores how relevant situational cues can influence our motivation, perhaps through one or more proximal psychological processes. I've put the website here. I suggest there's a lot of research there that's testing this. So what we get is a descriptive project which shows that the motivation to act committed is influenced by important relevant situational cues. So things like repeated interaction with a partner over time, high degrees of coordination, costly investment, etc. Crucially, though, and this is what I want to take out here, is that this motivation appears to be present in degrees. So it's a graded phenomenon, it looks like. So it's a natural question to ask, is there a conceptual counterpart? General response is something like no. Commitment is in place or not, while the motivation to meet it can fluctuate. So I am committed to playing the piano, but I have very little motivation to do so. I want to argue that there is something like a conceptual counterpart. So I want to introduce an idea of flexible commitments, right? And I'll set up the project quick. So if we take it that existing theoretical accounts of shared intention under-explain motivation, that the concurrence criterion is sometimes thought to be too strong, and that motivation to act committed seems to come in degrees, at least from empirical work, then perhaps a better characterization of commitments is needed, one which should involve some sort of degree-like feature which an agent's motivation tracks. So I'm asking questions like, how strong or rigid should commitments be? How strictly should the concurrence criterion be enforced? Is there a conceptual normative counterpart to the graded motivation to meet commitments, understood as like grades of commitment? So I appreciate that this is all quite abstract and not very tight at the moment. It might not be by the end either, and I'd appreciate some comments on this. But these are the kind of questions I want to ask. And I want to focus on Gilbert's notion of control rights over release. That is, that come with being in the position to require concurrence over release. So who should have control over claim rights or the right to release? That's the kind of basis for this project. And I want to avoid intuition, but how to do that? So it's not just, I think that this person should or shouldn't. Well, I want to focus on facts about the world. Specifically, I want to focus on the fact that the future is not perfectly predictable. It's open, and agents are uncertain about future world states. So by relying on the kind of facts about the world and uncertainty about the world, I'm hoping to avoid intuition in answering this question of, how strong should commitments be or who should have control rights. I might not be, you can tell me. The idea is to look at varying control rights. So I want to adopt Gilbert's notion of claim rights, which is the party whose concurrency is required for a joint action partner to be released from their commitment. Should the person to whom the commitment has made always have claim rights over release? Traditional views generally, Gilbert's response, I think, in parts of her work, is that control of claim rights is vested with the receiver of the commitment. This is necessary to facilitate the kind of reliance that she needs in her account, and so should always better support shared activity. We've got a normative standard to judge by, right? We've got how a commitment relation best supports shared activity, and this is the normative standard that I want to use. How shared activity is best supported. That seems like a relatively uncontroversial normative standard. So there's a nice question here, which is, are there circumstances under which the traditional view is inefficient with respect to our normative standard? Are there circumstances under which the traditional view is inefficient with respect to our normative standard? My proposal is that varying control of claim rights of release can better support shared activities when there's uncertainty about the future, specifically when future benefits and costs of the joint action are not perfectly predictable. And I want to do this by using a couple of scenarios, okay? And we can take it from there. So I've first got a setup, a simple setup, which is we've got a joint action involving two jointly committed agents, A1 and A2, their respective contributions, which are C1 and C2, but where C1 and C2 need not be identical, right? So the contribution need not be exactly the same. So this might differ a little bit from the kind of joint activity we often think about, where agents are coordinating and doing kind of similar actions or similar activities in an immediate time and space. But yeah, so C1 and C2 are not identical. The benefits from successfully acting together are B. For simplicity, I'm going to assume that the benefits are the same for both parties. I'm going to assume that agents are risk neutral. And I'm going to assume the reservation utility is 0. So there are no attractive alternatives to the joint action. Of course, we can relax these assumptions, but for now, this seems to make the point clear. So I've got two kind of major factors that I want to assume. Features of the account that I want to assume. The first is that we've got two future world states for agent 2. So in our world, A1 is always going to invest or plans to invest. So the point is, how is A2 motivated? Or to contribute rather than invest. But A2 faces two possible futures. A future state in which a second agent must contribute high costs into the joint action. This is going to occur with a probability of pi. A future state in which A2 must contribute low costs into the joint action, occurring with a probability of 1 minus pi. There are two time periods. So at time 0, A2's cost requirement to the future is unknown. So it's not verifiable at the time of making the commitment. Though pi is known, the probability is known, but the actual costs are not known. But just before time 1, so just before agent 2 must contribute or not, the cost is observable. So the agent knows now how much they must contribute, right? So when they have to make the commitment, they don't know, but once they actually have to perform the action, they do. The probability distribution of C, so pi is common knowledge, ex ante, and I'm assuming that ex post commitment is voluntary. So you can commit, but you can't force someone to commit or not, right? Or to perform, to enter into the commitment or not to perform their part. They must do it on their own volition. So we remove things like force and control. Second assumption I want to make is I want to define two types of commitment relation, which vary according to control rights. So in the first case, we have a rigid commitment, in which the receiver always has control over release. The concurrence condition is required. And the second is a flexible commitment, in which both the maker and receiver have control over release. So we've got this is where I want to, this is the kind of key part here, which is this control rights, rigid versus flexible commitments. There's going to be a sanction which is invoked when you violate a commitment, but notably it's going to be 0 in the case of flexible commitments, right? So the sanction is only if you violate a rigid commitment. What kind of sanction? It doesn't have to be punitive or anything like this. We can assume something like possibilities of no future interaction or prohibitively high future sanctions, something like that. I don't think the account is dependent on that. And I'm going to assume that no joint action takes place absent any type of commitment. So we need rigid or flexible commitments at least. So the proposal is that varying control over the right to release can better support shared activities when there's uncertainty about the future, specifically when future costs of the joint action are not perfectly predictable. The intuition behind this is as follows. The possibility of bearing high contribution costs may discourage one or more parties from committing at all, though it could be socially beneficial for them to do so. Right? So we're going to have a tree-like diagram. I'm going to go through it quite quickly. Again, pause if necessary. So I'm going to assume that A1 always commits. This is not necessary, but for now it is. And I'm concerned with A2. So A2 is the option of committing or not committing. Okay, if they don't commit, as I said, there's no parties are affected. So I'm going to assume for now that if they don't commit, then A1 doesn't incur costs. It's not necessarily the case. If I've made a fundamental mistake here, then hopefully someone can point that out. But basically, if they don't commit, neither party gets anything. So once A2 has decided whether or not to commit, nature takes its course. Okay, and nature then determines whether A2 faces high cost with probability pi or low cost with probability 1 minus pi. This, remember, time 0, A2 is making the commitment, and at time 1, they face the kind of costs that they have incurred. They now know them. And crucially, A1 also knows them. And then A2 must decide whether or not to contribute. Okay, so we've got a contribute or not. And what I'm going to show here is the kind of net benefit to each. So you'll see that for A1, it's always the benefit minus the cost, right? For A2, it's going to be the benefit minus the relevant cost, whether it's high or low, or the sanction in the case of when they don't contribute. So now we're going to look at a scenario in which there's a single interaction, right? And we've got some potential costs here. Remember, these costs are indicative. We can change them as we go. They're just for illustration purposes. So we can work out the net benefit in each of these cases here. Right, and what I've done is I've highlighted player 2, agent 2's best response in the case of high and low costs. So what we've got here is we've got if A2 faces high costs, their best response is not to contribute, even with the sanction, because it's a relatively small sanction. If they face low costs, their best response is to contribute to the joint action. Okay. What we can work out then is we can actually work out when agent 2, right, will choose to commit rather than not commit. And that'll be the case when the expected utility of not contributing when on high costs plus contributing in low costs outweighs getting 0. And so that's what we've got in the bottom corner here. So we can actually work out is a threshold probability of pi, which in this case is 0.6. And the intuition behind this is as follows. So if pi is smaller than 0.6, so the likelihood of having a high cost is smaller than 0.6, then A2 will commit because the expected benefits of committing outweigh the expected benefits of not committing. So if commitments are rigid, then B may choose not to commit at all in the present, given the probability of incurring a high cost. But if pi is smaller than 0.6, they will commit. If pi is greater than 0.6, A2 won't commit. Right? Now we've got a much stronger sanction. So what we see here is should A2 commit, in both cases, they will contribute. So A2 will contribute should they commit in both future states of the world. But now, crucially, what you can see is that they'll only commit if pi is smaller, right? So now pi is worked out to be 0.43. So what we see is with higher sanctions, given the costs, so given relative cost and benefits, with higher sanctions, A2 needs the chance of high cost to be even less likely. They need even greater assurance that they won't have to pay a high cost, given the possibility of strong sanctions. Third scenario is now what I'm calling the flexible no sanction scenario. So flexible commitments are those in which control rights over release of an action performance are vested in both parties. So there's no sanction when commitments are not met. That party has the right not to perform their part. Okay. Now we see that A2, right, pi equals 1, will always commit, but won't contribute when the costs are high, as before. The rationale is that they can always do at least as well as committing, right? They're not engaging at all. So even if the costs are high, they don't have to commit, 0. But if the costs are low, they have an opportunity. So we see that no sanction makes it more likely that a party who is uncertain about the future contribution will commit. So we've got a hint here of something, right, of when it might be useful to have flexibility in commitments. But crucially, we still have agent 2 not contributing. And so why would we want that to be the case? Well, what we need to go is to the final scenario, which is to look at the individual versus the group. So on the right-hand side here, you can see that the net group benefit. So the net benefit across both A1 and A2. And you can see when there are large social benefits to be had in the case of A2's costs are low, there are large social benefits to be had in the case A2 costs are low relative to when A2's costs are high. So in the red box here, what we can work out is the group optimal threshold given A2's expected choices. And we work this out to be 0.66. And so we see here that the group optimal threshold, right, of 0.66 is higher than A2's optimal threshold of 0.6. So in cases near the threshold, the expected social benefit is maximized if sanctions are weaker, so if A2 faces high costs and doesn't contribute. So if, for example, pi is 0.63, remember pi is known beforehand, then A2 wouldn't commit, even though it would be in the group's interest for him to commit. So that is, if there are large social benefits to be had, then it makes sense to encourage A2 to participate by not sanctioning them, or sanctioning them less, in a possible future outcome where they find themselves burdened with high costs. So, thank you for listening. It's been quite here. Thank you. So, I'm going to quickly go through what we've learned. So, we learned that parties are more willing to risk incurring high costs if the threat of sanction is low. Intuitively, that seems to make sense. We've learned that parties are less willing to risk incurring high costs if those costs are going to be high. That makes sense as well. And importantly here, we learned that the greater the benefits from the joint action, the more it makes sense to encourage A2's contribution by relaxing sanctions. Remember, there are many more interactions and other factors that we could care about. So fairness concerns about relative costs and benefits, asymmetric knowledge, etc. So in summary, I've defined flexible commitments as commitments in which control over claim rights to release is vested with both parties rather than one. I've defined motivation as how likely an agent is to enter into a commitment or meet it once made. The normative standard is what best supports shared activity. And I've tried to show that given that the future is not perfectly predictable, commitments should be more or less flexible as judged by our normative standard. If flexibility ranges over a spectrum, this provides us with grounds for thinking about how commitments might be graded. Namely, they partly depend on the extent to which there's uncertainty about future costs to be incurred. And flexibility could track how motivated one or more agents is to enter into a commitment. Right? When the benefits to the collective action are substantial, they might be less motivated, we might want to allow more flexibility. So in conclusion, perhaps criticism of Gilbert is right. The no unilateral withdrawal condition might not be the best way to support shared activity. Intuition is this: such a condition, concurrence criterion, works well when the future is perfectly known, when we're just trying to stop someone from changing their mind. Otherwise, anticipating that one or more parties will find it difficult to meet their commitment, if pi is high, makes room for allowing flexibility and release from the obligation to do so. It also gives us ground for when we might expect others to be motivated to meet their commitments. I think this provides grounds for conceptualizing graded commitment, graded according to more or less control over the right to release, given a pragmatic contextual rationale. And this is not unfamiliar thinking. In fact, I'd give a shout out to economic theory regarding incomplete contracts, which show that debt-like contracts can be socially inefficient when we're uncertain about the future. Does this fit with our intuition? Is it acceptable that a party who finds themselves placed under an unacceptably high burden to contribute can release themselves from the obligation to do so? Yes, perhaps, though it depends on both individual and group-specific factors, like the joint benefits to both. Thank you very much.